Colin Rubenstein, we've been reporting here on Sky, and even left-wing media outlet Crikey has been reporting about how Anthony Albanese, in his early parliamentary career in the year 2000, joined pro-Palestinian protesters at a rally in Sydney where Israeli and American flags were burned. Do you think his history as a Palestinian activist has prevented him from calling out some of the aggression and violence that we've seen at protests around the country, and from taking a stronger position on anti-Semitism?
Well, Sharri, thanks for having me on. I mean, the Prime Minister's history is no secret. You've divulged it, as have others, and the Prime Minister himself today said again, he's been a long-standing, passionate supporter of the Palestinians. And meeting with Arafat in the 90s, I don't think that's original sin. Many people met with Arafat during the Oslo process in the hope that the Palestinians would actually move forward, accept the reality of Israel and a two-state outcome. Of course, the great tragedy is, as we saw in the explosion of the Intifada, the rejection of the Barack and President Clinton initiatives for a two-state outcome. We saw the Palestinians lurch towards continued extremism, wanting their own state, not alongside Israel in peace, but instead of Israel, which has remained a continuing problem ever since, rejecting the peace offers, the two-state outcomes that have been offered repeatedly by Israeli leaders, be it President Olmert, even Prime Minister Olmert, Prime Minister Netanyahu. So the pity is that while the Prime Minister has mellowed somewhat over the years, he opposes the BDS, he accepts the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is criticism of Israel is legitimate, but comparing Israel to Nazi Germany or wishing for the elimination of Israel from the river to the sea and an intifada is inappropriate. He accepts those positions, but I don't know that he's understood the realities of the situation over the last 2 decades, that the reason we don't get to the two-state outcome is the continuing extremism of the Palestinians, and the need for him to focus on that rather than giving free kicks to the Palestinians in terms of possible recognition, which will only reinforce that extremism rather than encourage the moderation that is essential for moving forward to a resolution of the crisis.
Let's bring James Patterson back in. James, so earlier in the evening, I revealed that Albanese met with the late Palestinian President Yasser Arafat in 1998 in an all-expenses-paid sponsored trip by the PLO. He didn't meet with Israeli leaders on the same trip. 2 years later, he then joined pro-Palestinian protests during the Second Intifada when there were terrorist attacks against Israelis. Innocents were killed. Albanese joined those protests, flags were burned. What's your reaction to these revelations?
Well, Sharri, I can't say I'm very surprised that a Prime Minister who only a few years ago thought it was appropriate to post selfies with an avowed anti-Semite in Jeremy Corbyn has been palling around with and indeed worshipping Yasser Arafat and taking all expenses paid trips by the Palestinian Liberation Organisation to visit the Middle East. And I want to be fair to him and say, yes, he met Yasser Arafat in 1998. It was before the Second Intifada. Except, Sharri, as you've demonstrated in your program, Anthony Albanese's views didn't change after the Second Intifada. In fact, if anything, they just got worse. They hardened even further. And let's remember what the Second Intifada was and what it involved. A 15-year-old Australian citizen, Malky Roth, was at a pizza restaurant in Tel Aviv, minding her own business, when a Palestinian terrorist walked in and blew himself up, blew her up, and 14 other innocent people. That's what the Second Intifada was. And yet in response to the Second Intifada, Anthony Albanese thought that the right thing to do was to turn up to rallies where they burned Israeli flags and American flags, where he indulged some of the extremists in the pro-Palestinian movement in this country. And he's done it ever since. And I said on your program on Monday night, he's the most anti-Israel Prime Minister we've ever had. I don't say that lightly. I think it's well supported by evidence, and you've just provided further evidence of it tonight.
Just a quick follow-up there before I go back to Colin. How do you think this has impacted on his leadership in Australia since October 7?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, I think a lot of Australians just assume he's a weak Prime Minister and he's terrified of the Greens political party, and that's why he's been unable to unequivocally condemn anti-Semitism on its own without linking it to Islamophobia or other issues. But actually, I think he has a deep-seated sympathy for the Palestinian cause, which goes far beyond a genuine humanitarian sympathy for Palestinian people, which we should all have, and really goes into anti-Israel bias and hatred. And I think that is reflected over a long period of time. I mean, some of his statements in the House of Representatives have been filled with bile, have been shockingly biased against Israel, have been totally unbalanced. And I think that has really impacted his ability to stand strong as Prime Minister against a moral crisis in our own country of anti-Semitism.
Look, we've also seen Penny Wong just this week refuse to rule out supporting a Palestinian state, even if Hamas still played some role in the governing of Gaza. Colin, what's your reaction to this?
Well, it's a complete contradiction in her position and the government's position. On the one hand, they realise Hamas is a banned terrorist organisation, an extreme organisation engaged in the worst sort of terrorism in recent history, the greatest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. It's abhorrent, as the Prime Minister said today, and they shouldn't have a role in the future. Then on the other hand, they're referring to the possibility of early recognition of a Palestinian state, voting for that UN resolution 3 weeks ago and previous statements to that effect. It represents a complete contradiction that Hamas will continue to be governing in Gaza and calling for a permanent ceasefire. So there's a lack of moral clarity and there's a lack of recognition of what the facts are. Early recognition of Palestinians won't increase the possibility of moving towards a reconciliation. It simply reinforces terrorism and rewards terrorism. And that's the tragedy in the current situation, I think. It's really totally counterproductive to moving towards some sort of reasonable resolution.